Chapter 4 is all about sex determination in multiple species, as well as some of the characteristics that are linked on the sex chromosomes. So, sex linked traits are really vast in our population. So, they can range from hemophilia, which we talked about in Chapter 1 in the royal families, to red and green color blindness that expresses itself mostly in males, congenital night blindness, high blood pressure, muscular dystrophy, and then Fragile X syndrome as well. So, sex-linked traits are going to be genes that code for conditions that are located on non-homologous regions and are expressed without restrictions. So, that means that they're not going to be, they're either going to be present or not present. There's not going to be any blocking effects. So the sex-linked traits can be linked back to sex-linked alleles. So you may get dominant recessive patterns of expression because if you get one allele that coming from mom that codes for a genetic defect and one from dad that is normal, and it's a dominant recessive relationship, you may not see any expressivity in the offspring, but that offspring may be a carrier. So sex-linked traits are interesting because they also produce distinct patterns of inheritance in males and in females. So, for example, red-green color blindness shows up very rarely in females, but it's most expressed by males, and it's actually passed down through the X chromosome, so it comes through the mother. So in Chapter 4, we're going to talk a lot about sex determination. We'll go ahead and start with humans, because everybody's the most familiar with this. So this is going to be in most mammal species. So sex is determined based on the sexual reproductive process. And just to keep you guys, or to keep in mind, meiosis is what's going to produce haploid gametes. And then fertilization of those gametes are going to produce a diploid zygote after it goes through meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. So from that, the sex of the new individual is going to be determined by homogametic sex determination, where you have a male is going to possess one X and one Y chromosome, a female is going to produce or is going to express two X chromosomes. So males are going to be the sex that actually determines what the next offspring will be, because they actually have a choice of what allele they can pass on. They can either pass on a Y or they can pass on an X, whereas the female can only pass on an X. Therefore, if you were to do a Punnett square, you see that we get a 50% rate of females to a 50% rate of males, and it's really the male that is determining the sex in most of our mammalian species. So sex chromosomes are going to be shown and visualized with a karyotype. And as you can see here, this is a karyotype for Dr. Daly's youngest son, Robbie, and he's clearly a boy, as he has a Y chromosome, which is much smaller in total size compared to the X chromosome. So in our human species, we have 22 pairs of autosomes and 1 pair of sex chromosomes. So just to keep going with the mammalian sex determination, sex is really going to be determined based on, or in humans, based on the sex determining region Y, or the SRY gene. So if you guys have been through reproduction with Dr. Doyle or myself, this may be familiar. It's a gene that occurs on the X chromosome, and if that gene is present in a male offspring, then the SRY protein is produced, and that enables testes to be developed, Sertoli cells to secrete anti-Müllerian hormone, or AMH, as well as dihydrotestosterone testosterone. And then you get development of the male duct system and accessory sex glands. However, if that Y chromosome is not present, then you're not going to have any Y protein. So there's no SRY protein. Therefore, in the absence of that protein, you're going to have ovary development, no anti-Müllerian hormone, and you're going to have a complete female tract be produced from that situation. So this is the presence or the absence of the SRY protein. So in other species, we see different types of sex determination in grasshoppers. We see XX or XO, homogametic sex determination, where XX is going to be a female, very similar to humans. However, an XO is going to be a male. And XO is really referring to the lack of a chromosome. So you have one X chromosome and that is it. So that if they only have one X chromosome in grasshoppers, that individual will be male. In chickens, we actually have a ZW or ZZ sex determination, also heterogametic, where ZW is the female gender and ZZ is the male gender. So it's not necessarily our true XY determination. And then other types of sex determination that we see is haploid diploidy, and this occurs with bees. So bees, wasps, and ants actually don't have any sex chromosomes. So the presence or absence of total chromosomes found in the nucleus of each cell will determine what the sex is. So if there's only one copy of all the genetic material, the sex of that bee will be male, and if there's two copies, it will be female. Sex can also be determined in other species by the environment. So I think I told you guys about tortoises last week in class. Another example is the slipper limpet, and these organisms will settle on larvae on an unoccupied surface, and if they're present by themselves, they're going to develop into a female. And that female offspring is going to produce a bunch of chemicals that are going to attract more and more larvae. And then over time, the males that attach themselves to the top of the pile are going to switch sex, and they'll develop into females. So some of the syndromes that we see with sex characteristics are going to be like Turner's syndrome, which is where an individual only receives a single X chromosome. Klinefelter syndrome is where an individual is technically male because of the presence of the Y chromosome, but they inherit two X's from the female, or the male the male parent, and non-disjunction takes place, so you get the inheritance of two chromosomes. And then poly-X syndrome is where three X chromosomes will actually go through non-disjunction and result in an individual that has multiple X's. And then a last syndrome that we're going to talk about is androgen insensitivity syndrome, where a female actually has the genotype of XY. However, even though there's the presence of the Y chromosome, that individual is insensitive to androgens, so she doesn't have the ability to produce testosterone and some of the other androgens that are found in the system. So realize that all of these syndromes are pretty severe, and they have major issues on brain development. So a lot of individuals with these type of syndromes will actually be pretty severely mentally retarded. Some other traits and conditions that we see in sex determination is actually traits that are associated with the sex chromosomes. So one example we're going to talk about in lecture is tortoiseshell color pattern in cats. So the tortoiseshell gene is linked on the X chromosome. Therefore, if you have a cat that is a calico, she will always, always, always be female because that gene is linked to the X chromosome. And then a condition in humans called hairy ear syndrome is actually linked to the Y chromosome. So you can have males that have a lot of hair production in their ear areas. And then finally, androgen insensitivity can also be a sex-linked trait, as it is associated with that Y chromosome as well. All right, so that is the end of the prep lecture for Chapter 4. We will see you guys in class on Wednesday.